radical listening is about making the other person feel that you're not going to do that.
A powerful silence change the trajectory of a conversation.
When there's an awkward silence, but holding it means the other person has to take responsibility for what happens next.
People feel that their supervisor listens to them. They exhibit better organizational citizenship behaviors.
How might we craft an open-ended question with our people to spark some deeper thinking?
Notice what you make of it, and then what are we going to do with that? Now that we understand what you make of it, where are we going to head it? How might we experiment around with this or apply it?
The difference is radical listening is you're actually interested. It's not like you're looking like you're interested.
Robert, Christian, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks
so excited to be here. Thanks, Brandon.
Robert, you're local with me in the Portland, Oregon area. Christian, thank you for coming on. It's 9 p.m. your time, so I really value your ability to hop on and have this really important conversation. Your book is Radical Listening, The Art of True Connection. And if I think of things that really transform a workplace culture, it's the ability to listen. And I want to start with the obvious question. And I hope not everybody asks you this question to start a podcast, but the title is called Radical Listening. So what makes your approach so radical and important in this day and age right now?
Thank you, Brandon. Yeah, it's a great starting question, isn't it? And in fact, Robert and I, we did throw around different titles. We landed on radical listening and thought, if we're going to call it that, we've got to be able to back it up. So I think we have. It's radical because the purpose of listening is actually about building connection. So it's radical because we're not saying, it's just a way of communicating better, or if you listen in this way. We're actually suggesting that listening is the intervention itself. And like you said, Brandon, in this particular day and age, with everything that's going on, the distractions, but all the conflict that's out there, we think listening in the way we suggest, which is, highly respectful and curious and with the intention of building connection, we think that is a radical act.
So at the heart of the radical listening framework, which you have, and there's a great illustration which we can go into, at the core of it is positive intention. If that's not present, what can we expect to happen in some sort of interaction?
It's interesting. I think the quick and easy answer is you get poorer quality listening. You have to want to listen. You have to listen with sort of acceptance in mind, kind of figuring out in mind. But it's really the specifics of the intention. And that's one of the things I think is so radical about our approach, is that instead of listening being fundamentally about comprehension, it is a motivated act. So you might be listening in order to learn about something. You might be listening in order to problem solve, in order to validate someone's experience. And those are all really different forms of listening, and that you'll be paying attention to different slices of the conversation. So if I'm listening to fix something, I might be listening for processes, what's wrong, key components. If I'm listening to validate you, I might be listening more to your emotional tone, or some keywords related to that. So whatever your intention is going to completely guide your attention. And without that, I think you miss huge portions of the conversation that are critical to what you want to accomplish.
Robert, many people have heard of the term active listening, and that's something that many people on MySpace, the HR leadership, we've used that term. How does radical listening differ from active listening, or maybe perhaps build upon that?
I think build upon it is a great way to put it, because I don't want to denigrate active listening. It endures because it's effective, but it is largely around comprehension. It's the demonstration that I am listening to you. So it, of course, wants us to maintain eye contact, ask clarifying questions, summarize what you've said, and check in with you. And as we were writing the book, something occurred to me. I've never once, a single time with a friend or family member, ever summarized what they said. No one has ever said to me, oh, my daughter's engaged to be married. And I'm like, so it sounds like what you're telling me is that there's a big wedding coming up.
So true.
You just assume that you have it. And I think that we can sort of sidestep that. I think that becomes kind of a conversational crutch, if you will. And what we suggest instead is if you just ask a question that's targeted to what the person said, that itself is a powerful demonstration of listening. So again, if someone says, my daughter just got engaged to be married, like, oh, tell me more about it. Or how did you hear about it? Or what was the proposal like? And then, of course, the person knows that you understood them.
When I think about listening, I feel like there's a ton of barriers that exist to like effective listening, and probably with the stuff that we're talking about today with radical listening, to get to the point where people are using this framework, which we're going to talk about, there's a lot of distractions and barriers. What are some of those things that you've encountered that need to basically be taken away from the equation in order to really start with positive intention in this radical listening framework?
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. That's I think one of the things we talk about is the idea, one of our skills is actually quieting. And quieting, there's two aspects to quieting. One is, of course, trying to create an external environment where we can do our best listening. But the other part of quieting is the internal talk, anything internal that's getting in the way. And I think that's where the barriers come in. And really, step one is noticing the barriers. So for your listeners now, I'd like to invite them to think about situations where they know it's going to be difficult to give somebody their full attention. And I think if you work in an organization, you'll immediately be able to think, oh, that conversation is going to be difficult for me to stay in listening mode, right? And so there's a few that we've talked about in our book. I'll highlight a few of them. One is, I haven't got time for this. We call that time poverty. So imagine somebody comes up to you, a colleague jumps in, pops by, or says, can I have 10 minutes? And you're really thinking, I've just got so much on today. There's so many other things. I really haven't got time for this. Now, of course, there's an immediate barrier. So when you notice yourself thinking, I haven't got time for it, well, obviously that's going to get in the way of giving somebody your full attention. So what we would recommend, of course, is either kind of agreeing that with the other person to say, look, I've got 5 minutes now, and we can give radical listening in a 2-minute block even. Or say something like, look, I'm really interested in what you have to say, but right now I haven't got time for it, and agree another time, for example. The other fun barriers for me, I think they're kind of fun anyway. One barrier is the competing. We call it competing, right? So somebody comes along and says, oh, you won't believe it. I've got like 100 unread emails in my inbox. I don't know if any of your listeners can relate to that.
Oh, yeah, I can.
But imagine somebody comes to you and says, oh, I've got 100. Now, one of the things we talk about is optimal matching. So I just want to pause the example there to think, well, what does that person want when they're coming to you and saying, I've got 100 unread emails? They're probably wanting some kind of acknowledgement or empathy or something to show that we care about them. But sometimes what pops into our head is this competing thing of, you've got 100 and I've got 200 unread emails in my inbox. So I think there are some typical listening barriers. We talk about them in the book because I think it's helpful to just be aware of those barriers. And more broadly with radical listening, we think that every conversation is an opportunity to build connection, every conversation. And for our listeners, just for them to take a moment to imagine the number of conversations that happen in any workday. Each of those is an opportunity for connection. And we talk about this idea of optimal matching, which is like in the example I gave, noticing. So another one of our skills is noticing. So notice, okay, this person's come to me to tell me they've got 100 unread emails. What is it they'd like? And then matching the intention of our listening to what's wanted. So I think in that case, some kind of acknowledgement would be the most helpful interaction. And we argue that if we get that matching right, that leads to connection.
Do you mind if I add on to this, Brandon?
Please.
It's interesting because oftentimes at work, many of our conversational gambits are well-intentioned. They're offered when we're trying to listen with the idea that, oh, the person will like this. This will be common ground. We'll connect in some way. And even that competing that he mentioned, like you've got 100 unread emails, I've got 200, could be offered with like, see, we're in it together. We're both overloaded with emails, but it runs the risk of distracting. And the time poverty he mentioned as well, you find a version of this that we think of as walk with me, which is you come to me, you've got something present, and I'm like, well, I've got a meeting in 7 minutes. Walk with me and tell me your issue while I'm on my way to my meeting. It's well-intentioned. You're trying to say, look, even though I'm a busy person, I'm going to make time for you. But it communicates to the person, you're in second place. My mind's already ahead of time. I'm thinking about something else. At best, I'm wedging you in here. And, I think it can be damaging, even though it's very well-intentioned.
Yeah, it's well said. A good example too. Let's step back a little bit. We've talked about the radical listening framework. I'm looking at the graphic right now, beautifully illustrated. I think Christian, you did this right. But it's a really good framework. And one of you maybe do your best to explain at a high level how you came up with this framework and what are the components to it.
The way we came up with it is really interesting, Brandon. Both Robert and I have a very big interest in communicating effectively. So that's something we're quite interested in. And we were actually offered a chance to write this book on listening. So it was almost like the publisher's like, hey, we're looking for a book around listening. And it's something we both have this shared interest in. And the little drawing that you see was literally hand drawn when Robert and I went for a writing retreat. We went for a writing retreat and we were kind of sketching things out. So that's how that drawing emerged. And so it tells a big story. The fact that positive intention is right in the heart really emphasizes what one of the radical ideas is that rather than starting with a topic or I need to say something to this person, start with an intention. What's my positive intention for the next interaction? Then we've highlighted those 6 skills, and we want to make this tangible. We want people to be able to go away and say, okay, I'm going to develop some of these skills further. So we've got a set of external skills. And what that means is these are things that your conversational partner would be able to notice and see. Then there's the internal skills. Those are the things that are going on in the mind of the listener. And then on the outside of the model, we've got these, the motivators, if you like. And there's social motivators and cognitive motivators. And that's how this model developed. And the idea is that, all of us, most of us are able to listen. We do it even if we don't want to. We're just kind of imagining how powerful could it be if we became intentional about these. And it's almost like dialing up our ability to listen in order to build connection and get better results.
I love that. We'll get into some of the ideas there. But I did want to cover one area. You said that listeners should be more like sponges. And I thought that was interesting. Maybe elaborate on that. What do you mean by that?
It's such a good question. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even remember writing that. Is that okay to say?
Blacked out at the time. Yeah. Just such a good idea that you forgot.
I mean, it's a whole book, so every metaphor we use. Tell me, why don't you tell us, Brandon?
I thought it was interesting just because I had not quite thought about it. It's like, so do we as listeners sit back and be more silent than we need to, the active listening part, and really take in before we get distracted by our emails that are in our inbox or our cell phone that is going off while we're sitting here having this conversation. I'm just kind of curious what true good listening looks like and why sponge was the metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of information out there, and listening is sort of wisely selecting and using the information. So you're not just taking in all information. There's a certain amount a sponge can take in before it's saturated. And if what you're taking in is what's happening outside the window on the street and thinking about what you're going to do on the weekend when you get home from work, that's crowding out the amount of absorbency you have. So you really want to be a little bit more judicious in your listening resources, if you will. I'm remembering now that.
Yeah, that's good. We talked about barriers before, and one of the things that I think people get caught doing when they listen is the mind reading, or assuming we know what the other person's going to say, so we cut them off. And how do we avoid falling into this trap? Because I mean, I find myself doing it all the time, especially with my wife or close colleagues, where I'm I feel like I just know exactly what they're going to say, and then want to jump in.
I think one way is just to have a vocabulary for these things. So mind reading, competing, time poverty, because then you can label, you can say, oh, I do that. I have a tendency to do that. And you almost can, I hate to use the word diagnose, but you almost could sort of label yourself this is really the one that's my Achilles heel. That I really tend to do a lot of mind reading. And I know that because I'm always saying, let me stop you right there. I think I know where you're going with this, or those kinds of classic phrases that would be something a mind reader would say. Comparing would be another one, right? Oh, I also had that experience. It's like a cousin to competing, but you're not trying to one up. You're saying, I know just how you feel. And once you know that you have a tendency to do that, I think you can be a little bit more on guard, and you can actually prepare for a conversation. I'm about to go into a team meeting and I'm just going to put a little bit of a leash on myself where mind reading is concerned, or I'm not going to do things that suggest to people I've got somewhere better to be, start packing up 3 minutes before the meeting's over. Those kinds of things.
This is a big question here that I'm about to ask, but what strategies can busy people use to avoid missing key signals? And you talked about the invisible gorilla in the book, and I remember watching that video several times where people are playing basketball and there's a panda that walks by, nobody sees it the first time around, and they slow it down because you were actually watching the basketball happening or whatever was going on in the scene because it was chaos. And then you slow down and there's a panda or whatever it is going by, or a person in a gorilla suit. And so that's we missed a key signal. This happens in our everyday work, especially when we're listening. How do we avoid that, missing key signals like the person in the gorilla suit?
I think two things. One, you're not going to completely avoid it. There's all sorts of, errors and continuity that we miss, all sorts of little details that float past us. It's easy to miss, for example, what's being left out of a conversation, what's not being said, who didn't attend the meeting. It's hard to notice what's not there. So just assume you're going to miss stuff and have a little bit of humility around that. But beyond that, this is why I think it's so important to understand what your intention is for the conversation, even if it's multiple intentions across, a long conversation. But if I know, look, I don't know much about this, Brandon is presenting, it's really his project, I'm just going in to learn. That idea that learning is front and center for me is going to direct my attention, and I'm going to be more likely to notice the stuff that's important for learning. Because everything you say, all that information is going to be plugged into my existing web of knowledge. And that's different than if I'm trying to validate with you, different if I'm trying to problem solve or brainstorm. And just knowing that isn't going to be proof against missing things, but it's going to be helpful to hit the things that matter.
Christian, quieting is one of the key internal listening skills. I think you mentioned it earlier. I'm curious if you could think of a scenario where a powerful silence changed the trajectory of a conversation or an outcome of a conversation, whereas somebody might just want to jump right in without even thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Quieting, use of silences and pauses can be a really powerful way of doing a couple of things. One is actually it's a great way of slowing down a conversation. Like we were just saying, you sometimes get caught in the busyness of things. So building a few more silences, those pauses in, slows things down, which can create a little bit more safety for people. So that would be a powerful thing. But in our everyday conversations outside the workplace, pauses are seen as awkward, aren't they? So there's
Yeah.
a little bit of self-awareness and noticing here. But the most powerful thing I've seen, I was in a team meeting, and somebody said something pretty insightful about something that was coming up, and they just said, "Look, I'm not sure if I should share this, but here's something." The facilitator of that meeting just paused and went quiet and then said, "I'm just taking in what you said." Then there was a pause, and all of us were quiet for that moment. So I think you could even use pauses and silences as a moment of appreciating or acknowledging something important that has been said. Now, the final way, both Robert and I are executive coaches as well. In my coaching practice, I use silences a lot. And the purpose of the silence there is to encourage the client to take more personal responsibility. So I think we can use it in that way as well. So when there's an awkward silence, it does feel awkward, but holding it means the other person has to take responsibility for what happens next.
And you mentioned in the book too that there's actually some cultural differences with the silence and pauses. Like I think Americans tend to jump right in, and I think you used Japanese folks. They tend to pause. So maybe give me some insight there, and then how that impacts multicultural workplaces.
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in this idea, Brandon. My mother who brought me up was Japanese. My father was Belgian. I grew up in Lebanon. So I'm always noticing how conversation happens. And, right now I'm in Spain. And here it's pretty common for people to talk over each other. It's not considered rude. You could be in a group of 6 people, and literally there isn't this turn taking. Everybody's kind of talking at the same time. But to go to your example, one of the things my mother taught me, and remember, she's Japanese, she said you should never interrupt people, never interrupt. So from that cultural perspective, if somebody's dominating the conversation, you would never jump in. So it can leave a huge gap because they're waiting. They're waiting for that opportunity to say something, but they would never jump in. Whereas in other cultural contexts, I'm not even going to pick a cultural context because I don't want to sound negative about it, but I've noticed many where there's a waiting for a pause. So there's a waiting for a pause so that the other person jumps in. And the funniest thing, Brandon, is that I've noticed that in some cultures, there are techniques, so there are no pauses. So either people like me talk very quickly, so there's no break, you can't get in anywhere. But then there's the other, I'm thinking, or you actually fill the gaps so other people don't jump in. And I would say radical listening is about making the other person feel that you're not going to do that. It's being respectful, waiting till the other, giving the other person the space to talk and think without worrying that their turn is going to be taken. And, one of the things that we think is most powerful about radical listening, really the output, if you like, Brandon, of radical listening is that your partner feels seen, valued, and heard. That's really, if your conversational partner feels that, you've been listening radically. And it's the opposite of not being listened to. And I think all of our listeners will be able to resonate with situations where they haven't been listened to, and how damaging or demotivating that can be. Brandon, I don't know, would it be okay for me to share a little anecdote about that?
Yeah, I got the time. It's the 9:30 for you.
For this topic, I've got all the time in the world. This is a true story. I've worked in organizations for many years, and the thing about me is I work hard, but I really want that to be appreciated. So if I'm valued, I'm going to put in 200%. So that's my big thing. And so you can imagine I was in an organization where they do performance reviews once a year. That's it. One time a year, I get a chance to go talk to my manager and tell them about everything that I've been doing. So I'd spent so much time preparing. I had notes, I had bullet points. I had, look, here are the things I did well, and here's some of the things I want to develop. And first warning sign, my manager kept shifting the meeting. Could we do it next week? Sorry, I've got something else going on. Oh, sorry, can we bring it down to 30 minutes? And I was okay with all of that. That's fine. Then I go in, and this is in the days of BlackBerry. I bet none of your listeners remember what that was.
Oh, come on. You're not that old.
Yeah, I feel old, man. But anyway, it was the days of the BlackBerry that had that little touch ball or whatever in it. And so my manager was actually in a different room. It wasn't my manager's office, different room, sitting face to face, but there was a window behind my manager. And so I got all my notes out, and my manager said, okay, so tell me what's going well. And I could see as I was talking, Brandon, that they were scrolling on their BlackBerry. They were kind of scrolling through their emails or something. I could see it in the window behind. And, I knew I wasn't being listened to. And literally, I mean, even as I'm telling you now, I feel a bit, deflated. But literally in that moment, I didn't have a voice. I literally couldn't say anything anymore. I just felt embarrassed. And when I could get something out, I said, look, shall we do this another time? It looks like you're busy with something else. And if the listeners here can kind of empathize with what I was feeling of not being listened to, radical listening's the exact opposite. If she were listening to me radically, I'd be thinking this person's interested in what I have to say. They kind of are curious about what's coming. They value me and appreciate me. So I just wanted to share that story so that we can tell, we know how powerful it is when you're not being listened to. This is like the opposite of that.
Yeah, Robert, go ahead, pop in.
Yeah. I'm sure that everyone can just resonate with that example, but I also want to point out that this shows up in research, organizational research as well. There's a wide range of research on the benefits of listening at work. Leaders who listen are viewed as more influential. Salespeople who listen perform better. I mean, they're sort of the things that you would expect. But one of the findings that I really like is that when people feel that their supervisor listens to them, they exhibit better organizational citizenship behaviors. So if you just have that, the opposite of what Christian just described, that I'm valued, the person cares about me, is giving me the time of day, really listening to me, you're bragging about work, not complaining about work, you're speaking well of the organization, you're showing up on time, you're volunteering in opportunities that are relevant to your role, like orienting a new hire. It really is beneficial for the organization as a whole.
I think Christian, you said this. Both of you are executive coaches, also, right? So you probably will love this question. How might we craft an open-ended question with our people to spark some deeper thinking and possibly steer conversation to a place it never would have gone without that question?
Well, one that jumps straight to me, one of the things I think about powerful questions is usually they're short, Brandon, in my experience. So I know this is going to sound very simple, but what do you think?
Yeah.
just in the middle of whatever's going on. Hey, what do you think? And especially for those people who, this might come back to cultural differences as well, because there's cultural differences. Some of us are more introverted. So this comes back to the skill of noticing, looking around the room, and you'll see somebody's looking a bit pensive. Somebody looks like they've just had a little insight. So I love that idea of, and what about you? What do you think? And, there's a very short question. It offers somebody the floor. It shows that you've seen them, especially if they're not the one who's normally going to jump in and say something. Just that invitation can be really powerful.
Robert, do you have a favorite question?
I would like to bracket his question with two others, not to boil all of coaching down to a very kind of simplistic model, but I think that we often ask sort of, we're all talking of all the stuff we've said, what do you notice about it? So that's kind of the first one, just what's standing out to you. Then Christian's question, what do you make of that? Right? That's what do you think about that? How do you feel? How does that strike you? Some variation of that. So notice what you make of it, and then what are we going to do with that? Now that we understand what you make of it, where are we going to head it? How might we experiment around with this or apply it?
And Brandon, if I could jump in and interject, that is now allowed because it's one of our skills.
I knew what you're doing.
It's not technically a question, but it works better than a question. Tell me more. Imagine somebody's just said something to you and they're excited about it. What a beautiful way to say, I want to listen some more to what you have to say. I'm interested. And so maybe coming back to the active listening, the difference between active listening and radical listening. And this is a little bit simplistic, but I've delivered active listening training programs, which were mostly about how to look like you're listening. All the strategies and tools. So you're kind of nodding, you're tilting your head in the right direction, you're kind of standing up if somebody comes they're almost like the techniques, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is radical listening is you're actually interested. It's not like you're looking like you're interested. And I mean this in a really meaningful way. It's not about how do I look like I'm interested. It's finding ways to be interested. And I think there's two ways, Brandon. One is really trying to immerse yourself in the topic and think, yeah, I'm curious about this. I want to know more. Tell me more about that. The other, if the topic isn't of interest to you, I love this idea of switching to, I'm interested in this person. I wonder what makes them tick. How come this thing's so exciting for you? What got you into this thing that you're talking about now? So that idea of not look interested, but be interested.
Christian, that idea of tell me more and what you just described reminds me so much of my kids growing up. They do this so well because they actually are interested and they ask why. And then you say, the reason, well, why? This is so simple, right? It's probably what you do in executive coaching.
Yeah, it is. And Brandon, I have to say, it's what you do as a podcast host. You've been doing that with us. You've been saying, tell me more, or I read this. So I think, yeah, executive coaches do it. Definitely podcast hosts like you do it too.
One of the chapters addresses listening to influence. And I think there's a big connection between good listening and influencing others. And I know people like me, I want to be influential on people. Is there a way to influence with just listening without saying much?
There absolutely is. And I think you have to take a moment and think about what you mean by influence.
Inspire others.
Being respectful, kind of what we've already been talking about, just saying I'm truly noticing you. I'm trying to align what I'm giving you as a listener with what you're hoping for. So if you just want me to say, gosh, you've got it so hard, work sounds tough this week, and I do that, that creates a really good relationship. And again, there's a whole research literature on listening at work that suggests that people have higher relationship satisfaction at work. They have higher trust at work. And once you have that trust in place, built on the respect of listening, that's where you have the door for more overt forms of influence.
Can I add something there, Brandon, as well? I was just thinking of your example of inspire. So, yeah, we can listen in a way that kind of gets people more excited. And that actually allows me to bring in that skill of interjection, which, by the way, was the most difficult for me to get on board with, because culturally speaking, I didn't like interruption. So I had to be convinced of this. But let's say your colleague's talking about, oh, you know what, I'm thinking of applying for this job. I'm not really sure. And you can be super excited. You can jump in. What? You're going to apply for that job? And they might say, yeah. Oh, tell me more. What's made you want to get into that job? And oh, yeah, didn't you also tell me more about that? And when was the last time? So you can actually build up energy through your listening. But let's say you want to influence somebody to be less energetic. Like we said, you can slow things down. You can bring in more pauses. And we have a little diagram in the book around levels of acknowledgement. And so by dialing acknowledgement up or down, we can actually influence the other person's motivation. We can influence their engagement. And it's so, for example, we have something called flatlining, which is you don't actually acknowledge something. You kind of almost ignore it. So let's say somebody says, you know what, I hate it around here. Nobody ever listens to me. I really don't, nobody pays attention at all to what I'm saying. The only good thing is this project that I'm working on. So I've got opportunities as the listener. I can say, oh, so you hate it around here. Or I can say, oh, so there is this project that's engaging for you. So what I've done is flatline on, oh, I hate it around here. Nobody listens to me. But if I had wanted to increase that, and this is what's interesting, Brandon, because I know in workplaces, most people are going in wanting to be supportive. So it's almost a natural tendency that if my colleague says, nobody listens to me around here, with good intention, like Robert said, I might say, yeah, I know nobody listens to me. And, did you remember the survey? And we're trying to make them feel better, but we're actually acknowledging the thing that might be demotivating. So we would say we'd flatline on the, oh, things are terrible, and really acknowledge the bits where they're saying, but there is this bit. So we turn our attention. So that's an example, I think, of listening to influence.
Well, let's wrap up with this. I know a lot of people listening, they're here to find some action items to make their workplace culture better. And if you think about things we can do to create that fertile ground, as you talk about in the book, for radical listening inside our workplace cultures, what are some of those like key actions that you would recommend taking?
One that I recommend to people, it might be frustrating because it's not like, oh, this is going to change everything on Monday. But I think you should spend a little bit of time just paying attention to the moments where you are actually listened to, and just pay attention, like, how does it feel to be listened to? What is the person doing that makes it feel like that communicates to me that I'm truly being taken in by them? And I think once you sort of embody that, for the lack of a better word, you're in a much better position to be motivated and turn around and do that for others.
Christian, you got any?
Yeah. My thing is just dive in and experiment. So one of the things is try out this idea of listening simply to appreciate someone, and with no other agenda. So this is practicing that positive intention of, I'm going to go along and I'm going to ask somebody a question. And my only intention, it's not to understand the thing that's going on. It's not to try and solve anything. I'm just going to listen in order to appreciate them. So this could be a colleague where you'd go and say, hey, how are things going? What kind of projects are you working on? And then, as we said, if our intention is to appreciate, we'll pick up the strengths in what they're saying. We'll pick up the things to celebrate. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier. I'd say try it at work, but maybe also at home. And I know many of us are more likely to be intentional in the workplace because we want the workplace to be a positive place to be. But I would say when you're practicing these things, how about bringing it home as well? So when your partner comes home, or if you've got kids and they come home, what a beautiful opportunity to say, look, I'm going to ask them about their day, not because I want to know what happened, but because it's going to give me opportunities to appreciate them, to acknowledge whether they've had a great day or a bad day. And like Robert says, this is by way of experimentation. How does that land? And I would argue, Brandon, that it's better for both parties. The person listened to, of course, they feel valued and appreciated, but so does the listener, because that person, you can see that that connection is building. And for us, radical listening is step one. It's building that connection. And once that connection is there, we think that's the basis of dialogue.
Really enjoyed this discussion with both of you. There's so much we didn't even cover, but that's okay. People are going to go buy the book. It's called Radical Listening, The Art of True Connection. Just really appreciate you both coming on. Is there a place to connect with either of you? Check out your work. I know you're both working on a ton of stuff outside of this book. So share anything that you want to share with the listeners.
Well, please check out my Coach on a Motorcycle. That's my website. Apart from writing books and doing this work, I just love being on a motorcycle. So coachonamotorcycle.com. I've got a lot of stuff there, YouTube clips, information, links to other things that I've done. So please have a look at that if you're interested.
And you can find me and information about the book at intentionalhappiness.com, my website.
My guests today have been Dr. Christian van Nieuwerburgh and Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. We really appreciate the work you do. Thanks for sharing these ideas and all the ideas you've been sharing over 500 episodes. So thanks so much, Brandon.
Thank you.